This is Cogitations with Carl Hartman, minister at Main Street Church of Christ in Lockney.
Well, good morning. I'm glad everybody has tuned in here to 106.1, the Flip FM, for another iteration of Cogitations here on this Sunday morning. I thought we were going to have a guest on today, but scheduling conflicts kind of hampered that from happening. But hopefully here next Sunday we'll have one or the other guest on. I'm going to be doing a session with a gentleman from Apologetics Press, doing a pre-recorded deal this coming Monday with them, and so that'll be coming on the program either the following Sunday or the next Sunday. And then my other guest will hopefully be able to get on and record a broadcast with them this next week too. But that's how life goes sometimes. You make all the plans in the world, and those plans just don't always pan out. And the Bible talks about that as well when it comes to time. I put an article in the Floyd County Record here recently titled that, Time. And it talks about how really we have zero control over the past or the future. I saw a demonstration a guy was doing, and it was on a broadcast also, like a podcast, and he was talking about time, and he had a regular sand hourglass there, and talking about the bottom time, that sand in the bottom, well, that's the past, and you can't do anything about the past. And he had the top of it covered, so you couldn't see the top half of the hourglass, and the fact that we don't know how much sand we have in the future. Our future is unwritten and uncertain, and we don't know how much time we have. And so all we have is those grains of sand that are passing through the narrow middle of the hourglass. That is the present moment that we're in. That's the right now. And that's it. That's all that we have to work with. And how do we spend that time? Well, you're spending your time, I think, wisely this morning by tuning into this program and letting your mind kind of contemplate the things regarding God and regarding His Word and regarding your religious walk and your spiritual walk. Last time we were on, we looked at Genesis chapter 6 and kind of the beginning of that into the flood, and we just kind of been highlighting in between these guests and stuff, different things in the scriptures that are just a little bit misunderstood or misrepresented through a lot of stories. And I was actually here recently looking at some child level Bible story books. So it's kind of like a Bible, but it's not a Bible with the scriptures laid out in it, but it just tells the stories. So it tells the story of creation. It tells the story of Cain and Abel. It tells the story of the flood, all through there, more in a story format than just reading chapter and verse. But I was happy to see when they were telling the flood that what we're going to talk about today is something that they actually did accurately. In a lot of kids' stories that are told about the flood and a lot of songs that are sung about the flood, they don't get this one part accurate. So if you want to turn over to Genesis chapter 7, that's what we'll be picking up today. Genesis chapter 7. So at this point, Noah has been instructed to build the ark. And actually, before we start into chapter 7, I want to back up. Let's back up just briefly to chapter 6. And we're going to look at, starting in verse 19. And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, and of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind. 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. And you shall take for yourself of all food that is eaten. And so, just pausing there, that's where a lot of people just stop and think, well, there's 2 of every kind. But the purpose is really found there in verse 20. 2 of every kind will come to you. They're just arriving in mated pairs, male and their female. They're coming to Noah in 2s, but he actually ends up with more than 2 of every species. And he would have to. Think about it. When he actually gets off of the ark, when the flood has subsided and they're on dry land again, he makes a sacrifice of 1 of every clean animal. So if there's only 2 of something and you sacrifice 1 of them, that species is now ceasing to exist because there's not a mated pair to mate. Plus, a lot of your unclean animals are predators that are going to be eating the other animals. So they would be 1 meal away from some species becoming extinct. So we get a little bit of clarity when we come to chapter 7. We got to understand in chapter 6, that's just how they're arriving to Noah. They're arriving in mated pairs. They will come to him in those mated pairs. But the actual number we find in chapter 7. And I really wish everybody just had the ancient scrolls in front of them, or at least a copy of them laid out. It's hard to get copies. I've been to universities that would have their own library of books that had the copies of all the ancient manuscripts in there. My dad has gotten a hold of several over the course of time that I've had access to, and it costs you thousands of dollars just to get a copy of something. And so it's highly expensive to get them, but you can get Bibles that are written in the original language, and you can use a lot of tools, even if you're not a master of Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek, to translate that out and figure out what that word means, such as the Strong's Concordance and the Vines and other such tools. And so we get enough clarity here in the English. Some of your translations probably read a little bit closer to the original than others, but we get an understanding. So we're just going to start there in verse 1 of chapter 7. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." So at this point, the ark is basically becoming their house. Verse 2, "You shall take with you 7 each of every clean animal, a male and his female." All right. So this is 7 pair. The English, and this is the New American Standard, or sorry, New King James Version I'm reading from here today. It kind of leaves out that clarity, that pair. But it's 7 each of every clean, a male and his female. It's 7 pair. Because if you have 7, it's male and it's female. Well, if you're bringing them in by 2s, well, you can't have an odd number, can you? All right. And so you got to use a little reasoning in this English. But each of every clean animal, a male and his female. So you can't have a male and his female if there's only a total of 7. So it's 7 pair. And all the scholars understand that that's 7 pair. And so you have 14 then of every clean animal. 7 pair. It's male and it's female. Then as you continue in it, it's the same kind of setup for the unclean, but a lower number. 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female. So again, 2 mated pair. 4. And why is that? Well, you have now, let's just say, 14 gazelle and 4 tigers. The tigers are going to want to eat after they get off the ark, some of them gazelle, right? So it gives the food chain. You have chances to reproduce and the food chain. And there's a good possibility they had some litters during the flood. So some offspring of these animals might have been produced during the flood, but the Bible doesn't really specify on that. Verse 3, as you continue there in Genesis chapter 7, also 7 each of birds of the air, male and female, so again, 7 mated pair, to keep the species alive on the face of all the earth. For after 7 more days I will cause it to rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made. And so what we have here is these coming. Now, again, there's going to be 14 of every kind of bird, 7 mated pair. And of course, a lot of even carnivorous birds eat other birds. You have to have a sustainable food chain. And so that's what we have presented here. So one of the biggest misconceptions that we're addressing here is that there was only 2 of every kind of animal. And there wasn't just 2 of every kind of animal. They came to Noah in mated pairs, but there was 7 pair of every clean, 7 pair of every bird, and 2 pair of every unclean. Now, if you note, there's something missing here. What about the fishies, right? It doesn't mention the fishies. Well, what was the whole world going to be covered in? Water. Where do fish live? In the water. All of your life that lives in the water was not required. Now, some folks with a far bigger brain than me sat down and did massive calculations on water salinity, and they believe, based on the total volume of the planet, the total volume of existing freshwater sources, total volume of salt water, and then the rain that's coming from the sky would have been fresh water. The waters coming from the deep might have been a mixture, because a lot of your geysers are fresh water, but there's also geysers in the ocean. And so they believe, based on their estimated calculations in the volume of total fresh salt water, that there would have been a salinity equilibrium reached during the flood and the waters that covered the entirety of the planet that would have been able to sustain during that period both fresh and saltwater species. I'm glad they figured it out, because I wouldn't know where to begin to do those calculations. But that's what they believe. And so we have all of life preserved. And we have a multitude, a massive zoo on the ark with all of these animals, multiple pair of every species, so that life would continue. Now, they came in mated pairs. They might have even boarded in mated pairs and went through their stalls in mated pairs. But there's more than 2 of every kind of animal on the ark, except for the water-based life. So now we come, leaving that behind, now we come to another general misconception, and that's the amount of time that Noah was on the ark. We generally assume 40 days and 40 nights, and we read that part there in verse 4 of chapter 7 already, but note that that's just the amount of time that it rained, not the amount of time that the ark was afloat. And so we're going to begin to look at what gives us the actual time, and it's right there in Scripture, of Noah's time on the ark. So take a note of verse 6. Pan down to verse 6. So it tells us here, and if you have a pen and a piece of paper, I want you to write some numbers down. So it says Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth. So write down 600. I just wrote down 600. And we keep reading and just drop down to verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, so that's that 600th year, in the second month. So write down a 2 out there next to the 600 to represent the month of the year. And then it even tells us the day, the 17th day of the month. That day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So we have that 17 days. So what I have written out here in one line across the paper, 600, and then a 2, and then a 17. So that is when he got on the ark was shut up, and the flood began. And the flood, the waters that were pouring up out of the ground and down from the heavens, that continued for 40 days until the water level rose above the highest mountain, and everything was covered. Okay? So we're going to read a little bit further. Okay? And we're just going to jump way over to chapter 8. And in chapter 8, we're going to come down to verse 13. And it came to pass in the 601st year. So above the 600 you wrote, because we're going to do subtraction math, put 601. So above that 600, put 601, because it came to pass in the 601st year. Now, we're going to read a little further before you write anything down. In the first month, the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. But it's still too muddy to get out, and we learn that as we keep reading. And in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. And as you keep reading, that's when Noah then exits the ark. We've probably all been someplace that was underwater for a while, and after the water subsides, the mud's deep. I've been in mud above my knees before, not able to even hardly move. So they got to wait till that muddy ground hardens. So the waters have subsided, but you're still left with mud that needs to dry up. You got all this sediment that is probably settled there on the land. So we're going to go with that second month and 27th day that we read in verse 14. So above the 2, we're going to put a 2 for the second month. And it's the 27th day. So above the 17, we put 27. Because it is in the 601st year, second month, on the 27th day of the month, that the earth was dry. And then Noah and all the animals and everything exit out of the ark, and they go out on that dry land that's now hard enough to support them getting out and easily walking and moving, right? And so we do that quick math. 601 minus 600 is 1, 2 minus 2 is 0, and 27 minus 17 is 10. So the entirety of the time that they were on the ark, from the ark boarding up and the rains going, and the rains and everything continued for 40 days, and then they're afloat for the rest of that time as basically the waters slowly begin to subside. And it's a year and 10 days later when they step off of the ark. We often picture in our head just 40 days. He was on there for 40 days, a little over a month. No, he was slightly over a year and 10 days that he was on that ark. And so we see that from what we can read in chapter 7, verse 11, and then what we read over here in chapter 8, verses 13 and 14, and we get that picture. So going back, I had made mention earlier when talking about the animals. We see that in verse 20 about him sacrificing. Then Noah, this is chapter 8, verse 20, then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So, like I said before, he killed one of every clean animal. So another reason why God saw fit that there had to be more than one mated pair on there. Now, granted, they could have had babies while on the ark, but that ark was going to get super crowded super fast with all of these animals having babies on there. So one might think it's highly unlikely that they did. Maybe they all came off the ark pregnant, ready to keep the species alive and moving forward. So we're going to read a little bit further here. We got about 9 minutes left in the program. And I want to just jump into chapter 9 here and just understand a few things about what is now transpiring after the flood and the conditions. You know, Adam and Eve got kicked out of the garden, and that incurred some additional conditions on humanity that didn't exist prior to that. Here again, great sin, world is flooded, the remnant, now some additional conditions. So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the whole earth." That's another passage to remember, and we'll be looking at that in the near future. So be fruitful and multiply and fill the whole earth. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that move on the earth, and all of the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. And so that dread and that fear. Think about when you're walking out in the woods or out in the fields, and some little critter, some little animal there's a bird hopping around. Generally, when we as humans approach any animal hasn't been domesticated, what does it do? It cowers or runs away. That fear and that dread. Now, we also have the ability to domesticate these. They are given into your hand. And of course, that was how it was in the beginning. Adam was tasked with basically the care of the garden and all that was in it. And those animals came to him to be named. Verse 3, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs. What this passage indicates to me is that prior to the flood, God's dietary plan for man did not incorporate the meat, those living creatures. But now, following the flood, another thing that's added to our permissible diet is those living things. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs. So he's adding meat to a vegetable diet. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. This right here is something that gets carried further into the Israelites much later on when they receive that law that they're not supposed to eat anything with the blood still in it. And, you know, God knows everything. We as human beings, as we advance through time, our knowledge grows, our understanding of the human body, our understanding of nature increases. Where is most of the disease carried and transmitted? It's in the blood. God knew that. And so to protect mankind, he simply gives them this instruction. He doesn't get into all this discussion of infectious diseases and microorganisms because man wouldn't understand it at this time. They didn't have the technology and the capabilities of detecting these things and seeing these things and understanding these things. So he simply just makes it a command. Don't eat the blood. Don't consume the blood, because that blood has a high chance of causing you illness, causing you sickness, causing you infection, transmitting some kind of virus to you. And so just don't touch it. Gets more specific later on with the laws to Israel about the handling and doing this. We often think of the 10 Commandments. There is actually over 600 commandments given to them, and part of it was related to this food. So God's just basically looking out for their health as they now are going to consume the meat of living creatures. Verse 5, surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. And as for you, be fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth, and multiply in it. So again, here's another thing that we're going to have to face. Now, I imagine reading about the wickedness there in the beginning of chapter 6 and how everybody pretty much did what they wanted to do, there was probably already murder and killing going on and retribution for such. I mean, you can go all the way back to Cain. Cain murdered Abel. So it's nothing new, but this ideal of capital punishment is also laid out here. If you shed a man's blood, your blood's going to be shed. That's just the basic nature. We see that later on in the law that Moses brings down out of the mountain. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and ultimately a life for a life, right? Now, when we get to the new covenant, Jesus changes that up a little bit, right? That covenant that's for all people, all nations, not that covenant that was specifically for the physical people of Israel back in ancient times. No, this new covenant, Jesus points that out. You know, you heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But what does Jesus say? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. A whole different mindset is coming in there. There is no more ideal of vengeance and paying back life for life. We have to evolve past that in this new covenant. But also he mentions here, as we read in 5, the animals, and we run into that with our predatorial animals. Hey, walk alone through the African savanna, and there's a good chance you might get eaten by a lion. Just as the animals have a fear of us, well, sometimes when we're afraid and we have fear, we might try to channel that fear into the protection of our own life. And you'll see that with these animals. They can lash out. They can harm you. And so we have this conditions laid out there. Some additions that are given and some restrictions that are given to mankind after the flood, but most of it's perpetrated because of the events prior to the flood that led to the flood and the purpose that God removed that wickedness and wants to ensure that there is less wickedness in the future. But us being humans and being of our nature, we tend to gravitate for some reason to the wicked. And it takes our own self-will with a knowledge that God has given us of right and wrong to pursue righteousness and to deny that ungodliness. I want to close by just flipping over to Titus chapter 2. If you'd like to flip over to Titus chapter 2, and we're just going to look at verse 11 there of Titus chapter 2. I'm trying to flip to Titus chapter 2. I just keep flipping back and forth. Titus chapter 2. For the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present age. That's what we're called to do as disciples of Christ. That's what Christ taught. He taught us to deny ungodliness, to deny worldly lust, to deny that wickedness, to live soberly, to live righteously, to live godly in the present age. I hope that God watches over you. I hope that you strive to do just that, to be that righteous vessel of God. Until next time, may God keep you, may God watch over you, and may God bless you.
Tune in next Sunday at 9 for another edition of Cogitations with Carl Hartman, minister at Main Street Church of Christ in Lockney.